I realised that I was changing as a leader. Up until that point, I think sometimes the fear of failure, the big challenges that arose, I channeled into more of a challenge mindset, and I realised my challenge mindset morphed into the opposite, sort of more of a threat mindset, and I started getting a bit scared about losing everything.
Olivia Humphrey was sitting in a vineyard in Napa Valley opposite a billionaire when she called on that challenger mindset. She called on the bravery she'd need to take on investment to turn her bootstrapped company into one of the greatest startup success stories going. You've probably heard of Netflix, a company that started out shipping DVDs via mail before building a global platform. Well, Olivia's company Kanopy is also a streaming platform, but focused on universities and libraries. But it's also the end of this story, the so-called exit strategy, that is just so fascinating. And I'm going to take you inside Olivia's exit from Kanopy, one that earned her a 9-figure sum and yet still left her feeling a little bruised. I'm Kelly Reardon, and from Dead Set Studios, this is Curveball. When Olivia Humphrey started her video streaming company, she correctly identified a pain point for university librarians. They wanted to show their students interesting films, but it was a massive headache trying to do deals with so many different independent filmmakers. And that's where Kanopy came in. Olivia did all the deals, stitched up those filmmakers and managed to do bulk deals with the universities. And there was a good profit for the independent filmmakers. The universities were happy and, of course, Olivia had a viable business model. So viable, in fact, that she packed up and moved to San Francisco to scale way up to some dizzying heights. But that did come at a cost. Olivia Humphrey, welcome to Curveball.
Thank you for having me.
Olivia, can you tell me how you first came up with the idea? Because you were working for Village Roadshow, but you had this idea of connecting filmmakers with universities. How did you put it all together as a business model?
So at Roadshow, I saw that students on campus went to the cinema a lot, but they didn't buy DVDs. And that didn't make a lot of sense to me because there's so much incredible film. And understanding that on campus, a lot of the resources focused on books and journals, the printed word, and not film, I thought there was a real opportunity to integrate film more into the academic curriculum. So I set up Kanopy really to help the distribution flow or overcome some of the distribution obstacles librarians were facing in ordering DVDs. So just like you go to a university or a public library and borrow a resource, the library pays for the resource, and I was literally selling the library the DVDs that the students would then borrow. And then streaming launched and YouTube, and I thought this is a way better way for students and online learning explosion to access these incredible films. So I launched the streaming solution a couple of years later and just shut down the DVD distribution business.
So the film industry is a tricky one, particularly independent film. It's really hard for those smaller art house filmmakers to make a career, and they certainly don't have the time to be shopping their films out to every individual university around the country. What value did you bring to them, and how did you resolve the sort of, I guess, the copyright or the release fees for them to distribute the films?
It was really important to me that the creatives of the films really shared in the profits of the company. It just seemed wrong to me that the creatives and the filmmakers generally receive the smallest piece of the pie in terms of the total revenue that the films make. And so at Kanopy, from the very beginning, I designed a model whereby 50% of gross revenues went straight back to the filmmaker or whoever we signed the deal for the rights to. And that is something I'm really, really proud of. It's something I don't know many other companies do. But it's also helped us be really, I guess, fiscally diligent, because imagine just half your revenue going straight out the door back to the filmmakers every quarter. But it's something that most filmmakers have really, really celebrated, that not only do they get a fair share of the revenue, we also had a very transparent system. So unlike Netflix, they could see every second of every video, what device their users are watching, what university or public library they were watching on, and they could actually almost forecast the royalty check they were going to receive every quarter, and we always made sure it was sent on time. And these things were something really unusual in the industry, but also made it a real sort of sense of partnership with Kanopy and the filmmaking industry that exists still today.
And then 2013 was such a pivotal year for Kanopy. You landed your very first contract with a university in the United States.
That's right. It was the University of Maine. And if you can imagine, just before we left Perth in Western Australia, the time difference was really quite revolting. I think it was 12 or 13 hours. So I remember being up at 3 or 4 in the morning to service this university. But of course, it was so exciting to have our first American institution sign up.
You'd run Kanopy pretty successfully for about 5 years from Perth at that point. And so what did you hope to gain by taking Kanopy to the US?
Well, at that point, Kanopy was servicing around 39 odd universities, nearly the entire market in Australia. And the US had over 4,500 higher education institutions. So I figured if I moved the business to the US and even just got a tiny proportion of the market, even a quarter of California alone, it would monumentally scale up the business. So how hard could it be? It seemed like a no-brainer to me.
And how did you finance that move? Because heading to the States, no mean feat getting started in another country, especially one like the US.
I think the advantage of bootstrapping the business up to that point meant that I'd been really sort of fiscally disciplined and the company was solidly profitable. I wasn't earning much myself in terms of a salary because I was ploughing all the profits back into the business, but I calculated that with the Australian business doing so well, that could fund the US business. Saying that, I didn't know what I didn't know and was very aware of that. So took on a very small angel investment from a Perth investor here. And that was really, really helpful. I think less about the money, more about the advice and I guess the counselling that he gave once I'd arrived.
And were you still running the show in the US sort of on your own, or did you take some of your staff from Australia across?
So it was just my husband and me in the US in the beginning and our staff in Australia really supporting all the US operations. My brother, who'd been studying over in Boston, came and joined the company as well. So it was the three of us in those early weeks. And we couldn't have done it without the, I'm going to say, 5 odd people back here in Perth who were just amazing, not only managing the entire Australia sort of Pacific market, but really doing all the heavy lifting for our US expansion.
And how did the culture of the company change once you went to the US? Because Silicon Valley is famously this, has this startup culture where everyone's working all hours. I think by this point you have a young baby. Can you describe for me what that first year in the US was like?
It was very busy and very confusing and often quite scary. And yes, my son was 10 months old. Moving to the US, I hadn't really taken into account the cultural differences that were there. And for example, I was used to leaving the office at around 5 so I could go home and walk home back in Perth and be with my family and be back for bath time. And then moving to the US and realising that wasn't the culture there, I actually turned that into an advantage. So when I was trying to attract staff in this pretty sort of scrappy office that I had down on the bay, I was saying in Australia we have 4 weeks leave. That's what we do. In Australia, in our office there, we leave at 5 so we can go and enjoy the sunshine and have a life. And we don't like long hours. And that's what I'm going to be doing, and that would be my expectation of you. So bringing this sort of Australian culture to San Francisco in a market, as you said, that was full of long hours and quite intense was, I think, a breath of fresh air for a lot of people. And that really helped attract staff in a very difficult market to attract staff. You
made a decision then to seek out venture capital funding. You'd pretty much bootstrapped until this point, other than your angel, who I think really just gave you a small amount to see you on your way. Why start to consider venture capital funding, particularly because I think you were somebody who didn't like the idea of going into massive debt?
That's exactly right. I'd never really had debt. Of course, I'd had a mortgage, but my whole life was revolved around paying off a mortgage. So it was really uncomfortable. About 3 years into our American adventure, yes, it was going well and it was sort of a relief. But I realized that I was changing as a leader. Up until that point, I think sometimes the fear of failure, the big challenges that arose, I channeled into more of a challenge mindset and rose to the occasion. It was almost exciting sometimes, thinking, how can we turn what looks like this impending doom into a competitive advantage? And I knew, because we were so lean and flexible up until that point, we were always able to overcome. And on reflection, these what seemed like a disaster turned out to be quite a win. And as the company became more profitable, the disasters didn't feel as disastrous. And I realised my challenge mindset morphed into the opposite, sort of more of a threat mindset. And I started getting a bit scared about losing everything, because the business on paper was worth so much. I mean, I still wasn't earning much. I was never the highest earner. I always had to pay market rates for engineers. And at that point, still would prefer to plough what I could have otherwise taken as a big salary back into growth or hiring new position. But I realised that wasn't the way to get to where I wanted to go. I started feeling a little bit trapped. I started wondering what would happen if there was a big market force even beyond my control that meant the company went under. And I stopped enjoying the role. And I realised the only way to solve that and sort of get my mojo back would be to effectively take some money off the table, take some chips off the table, so to speak, and sell some of the company. So I knew that I had some comfort, that my family had somewhere to go, a house, for example, back in Perth, should everything go wrong. And then I could begin to try and lead fearlessly again.
And your rationale, I guess, was so specific because you had this initial bootstrapping, no debt kind of mindset, whereas venture capital funding is kind of like monopoly money to some degree. Like, the valuations are ridiculous. How they value a company or the amount of money to sort of for you to burn through seems almost mythical in some ways. How difficult was it for you to kind of understand a different way to run a company?
I hadn't spent much time thinking about it. I just had my eye on the prize. I wanted a certain amount in the bank so that we could buy our house and then keep growing the business. And it was quite simple. And that didn't necessarily mean venture capital. In fact, I thought it might mean a media company or a competitor or a big library company. In fact, I started speaking to the big library companies who were very enthusiastic about a potential acquisition. And their valuations rolled in very, very high. Actually, this is quite interesting. It was 3 times higher than I eventually so-called sold for, the valuation. And the reason for that was when I looked at the big sort of multinational library companies, I felt quite depressed. I'd seen a lot of startups be acquired by these companies and sort of morph into the corporate abyss. And I just knew if I was going to lead this company for another, I didn't know how long, 5, 10 years, maybe the rest of my life, I knew I wouldn't survive in that environment. And I knew Kanopy wouldn't either. We needed a really buzzy, flexible, entrepreneurial home to keep growing. So I was not done. I was absolutely not done. I was not selling out. And that is why I decided not to sell to any of these large multinationals.
Can I take you back to that though? Because this is fascinating, right? You want to take some money off the table. You hadn't been drawing a salary really, or certainly not a market one, not a CEO type of salary. You get offered this great deal and you kind of walk away from it. And so were the other investment opportunities, even though they were lower, there? Or were you walking away and just hoping, crossing your fingers that something better would come up that felt like a better fit? This feels like a ballsy manoeuvre.
Interestingly, the deals didn't feel good. The valuation looked fine. It was probably where I thought the valuation should be, but it wasn't an exciting offer. I think the thought, as I said, of working in that environment, in that culture, just depressed me. And there were a lot of terms and earnouts and which also seemed to me I was losing control. So, for example, if I had to meet certain targets, I was in an environment with a whole lot of parameters that may mean I couldn't meet my targets. For example, using the big sales teams of the multinationals. And I had a fabulous sales team, a really buzzy sales team who truly understood film and were really visionary about their sales pitches. And I just thought losing that was very unattractive, and leading a company like that was not something I wanted to do, and I truly didn't think we would be able to grow the way I wanted to in that environment. So it wasn't a difficult decision. at all. But I did go and see a number of the top venture capital companies in San Francisco, LA, and New York. And I mean, looking back, my pitch was shocking. I hadn't been trained. I hadn't been to pitch school or in incubators. But I got the meetings really because the business on paper was so attractive. I mean, incredibly profitable with this huge, what they call in venture capital world, TAM, which is total addressable market, meaning there was a lot of growth to be had and a lot of opportunity. And so I was thinking that would probably be a better home for Kanopy, because venture capitals were used to startups and with a growth mindset. And I thought this could be a way to continue this great journey. But interestingly, although I got in the room and at the table every single time, the venture capitalists started off really excited. But at the very close of the meeting, they always said, look, everything is great except for one thing, so we're out. And that one thing is that you want to take some money off the table. And when we look to invest in a company like Kanopy, we're happy to give you whatever the valuation is at that point. But what we're not happy to do is for the founder to take that money and put it in their personal bank account. The founder has to put it back into the company as growth capital to continue growing the company. And despite my objections about why this was so important and why this was the only reason that I actually wanted the investment, for the safety and comfort of my family, so I could put that fear behind me and go on and lead the company into the future, nobody understood that whatsoever.
Olivia Humphrey has gone from selling DVDs to libraries from her spare bedroom to a US-based streaming business, battling it out with the tech titans of Silicon Valley. But she can't find the right investment deal. That is, until an enigmatic billionaire steps onto the scene. That's next on Curveball. I'm Kelly Reardon and this is Curveball, the show about crucible moments in the careers of great leaders. For Olivia Humphrey of Kanopy, one of those moments came when she turned down some pretty tempting investment deals. They didn't feel right because they couldn't help her wrestle back financial security for her family. Not a single investor understood that she was searching for personal security in order to once again lead from a position of fearlessness. Until one man changed everything for Kanopy. Olivia, how did you find Jam Najafi?
So Jam is just one of the best chapters of my career to date. And I had a mentor who used to head up home video for Paramount down in LA. And I was talking to him about this quandary that I was in, and I was starting to feel very trapped. I'd pretty much got to the end of the road thinking, no, I'm just going to keep having to grow the company and work out another way, how to overcome this problematic mindset I had. And Eric said to me, my mentor said to me, well, I've got this guy and he's in entertainment, he's in libraries, he's a really fantastic guy, he's a billionaire, and he sometimes invests in startups. So why don't you have a chat to him? So, of course, I was saying yes to everything. And I arranged to meet this gentleman named Jam Najafi, and he said, come up to my vineyard. So I drove up to his vineyard in Napa. And it was a really surreal experience driving into the vineyard because there was his private jet glinting in the sun through the vines. And I was like, keep it real, keep it real. I really felt like I was on some episode of some bad Netflix series going, this can't be real, this girl from Perth driving into here. And I was so nervous and walked in, and Jam sat down, we had breakfast served, and he took all my notes and put them down on the table and said, I don't want you to read them, I just want you to talk to me. Tell me why you're here. And there was something
I like this
about
already. You know, this is great, right? Just put your notes aside and let's just connect. Great. Amazing.
It is really amazing. And I just relaxed, and I just can't help it. The only way I can be is just me. So I was my authentic self, and I told the stories I've told you. And 42 minutes later, he said, let's do it. I understand completely what you're saying. You want some investment so you can put it in the bank, so you've got your comfort to go and keep growing this incredible company you've built over the past 7 years. And I want to help you, and let's do this together. Let's call it a partnership. We won't have a formal board. We've got this sort of advisory committee. We want to just help you. You move so fast and quickly, and you need to be flexible and nimble. And me and my team, we can help you do that. And that is how I I got through that really difficult time in about 2016.
How did you then scale the business with that investment that he chipped into the company? And I imagine that all of this is going on right when Netflix is taking off and people are understanding the potential of on-demand streaming. Of course, Kanopy doing it in more the university library space rather than kind of straight to consumer, but there's this groundswell happening at the time.
What was unexpected about having Jam come on as, I'll call him a partner, was the impact it had on the optics of the business. Up until then, it had been a bit, I guess, perceived as a bit of a dinky Australian business with this young Australian kid running it. And suddenly to have such a well-respected investor who owned NBA teams and owned Borders books and all sorts of great things investing in Kanopy, I really noticed people sat up and listened. For example, we couldn't even get a PR company interested in taking us on as a client because we didn't have any venture capital backing, just weren't interested in San Francisco. And as soon as Jam came on board, we had everybody knocking saying, can we represent you? Internally, of course, the staff being in San Francisco were used to a world where the companies they were working for had sort of sexy venture capitalists backing them. So I saw everyone sort of walking with a bit of a skip to their step. But it was interestingly it was an interesting time for me because remember Jam's valuation was a third less than other valuations that had come in. So it was a really, really wonderful moment for me of explaining to the staff why we were doing this and communicating that this was not about the valuation that the big library companies had come in with. This was about a valuation about 10 to 20 times higher than that. And this was the path to getting there. And I'm still quite proud of that decision because, as you said, it wasn't the logical decision. I wasn't doing it to sell out. It was a decision to really get Kanopy to a point where I knew it could be. And so you're right, riding the wave of online video streaming at this point was just incredibly helpful. Instead of communicating with the pitch process to sell into libraries, defining what streaming was and talking about bit rates, it all morphed into it's Netflix for libraries. And having that very easy way of explaining what we were doing made the process a lot quicker and faster. And to be honest, even with our tech team, with our developers and engineers, the brief was our students expect Kanopy to look and feel and act like Netflix. So we have to do whatever we can to make that happen. And having these really high aspirations, having Netflix as a role model, so to speak, they'd already been through all of their learnings. And so we were lucky enough to be able to look at Netflix and think, this is what we want to be. We don't have to make all the mistakes to get there. Let's just try and get there as quickly as we can was just a gift.
Was there any competitive nature to that, though, in that if your university students were starting to watch a lot of film on Netflix, was there a chance that they would sort of stop using Kanopy? Was there a moment where you thought, actually, this Netflix thing's going to crush us?
Well, Kanopy was curated with independent films. There was a lot of academic film, documentaries, foreign film, classic film, and a lot of these films were not on Netflix. So it was very, I never really thought that. In fact, I kind of thought the opposite. I thought Netflix was a real gift because if there were films that were on Netflix and on Kanopy, in my mind, these are independent films. You know, we're not talking about the big blockbuster Netflix series. We're talking about these films where we're all fighting the same fight. We all just want people to watch these films. These films often have really important social messages or some sort of social impact associated with them. And I can guarantee that the filmmakers behind them, all they want are people to see their film. So in my mind, we're all fighting the same fight, trying to get people to press play on one of these films rather than sort of a blockbuster junk food film, which is also fine, but not all the time.
At this time, you start to grow, and of course, that's often a time in the company where people start to take notice and people start to compete, and it starts to get a little bit nasty.
That was a really hard time. A big media influencer librarian, they do exist, and he called up and said, your competitors pay my private consulting fund, and if you want to survive, you have to pay into it too, and if you don't, it was really a threat. I will destroy you. And he actually said, word for word, and we'll send you packing back to Australia.
Oh my gosh.
And for me, where I had everything invested, working so hard with this amazing team, it was so demotivating, and I was really genuinely scared. But it was, again, out of these really hard, difficult moments, something, it sounds really corny, but nearly always something incredible blossoms out of it. And what blossomed out of that for me was the decision when I went home and with my amazing husband, I just said, I am not, first of all, we can't afford to do that. And secondly, it's just not in our makeup. We are not going to pay to play. Like that is just, I mean, I would rather fail and go back to Australia and say we did everything we can the right way and it didn't work than be successful in an underhand way. So it really wasn't a hard decision, but it did build up this sort of resilience and it lit something in my belly. As I said, this sort of challenge mindset I was talking about that I really grew to own over the years at Kanopy, where I sort of felt, you know what, I'm going to show you. I am going to have the market share in this country. I'm going to do it right. And the proof is in the pudding.
To me, there's a lot of things that you've said already around your values and leading from a values position, whether it's the way you treat your staff, telling them they can finish at 5 o'clock, whether it's knocking back investment that didn't feel right for you because it didn't align to the company's values, you know, having this crazy competitor come in and try and threaten you and you saying, you know what, he could ruin us, but I can put my hand on my heart and say we did what we can. Was it ever hard to hold on to those values through the journey when it got rough or tough? Or did you and did you consciously sort of go back to what are my principles?
Yes and no. So I would say it was easy to hold on to those values because that was really the only way I could run the company, remembering that we were independent film, working with filmmakers and librarians. Neither industry does anyone go into expecting to become a billionaire. So we're working with stakeholders that are truly passionate. You know, these filmmakers truly believe these films are going to change the world. The librarians are in the business of sharing information in a democratic way. It was just an incredible experience. And the staff at Kanopy really believed in the mission, that they genuinely believed that when anybody pressed play on a Kanopy film, the world was a better place. And they believed that and were working at Kanopy because otherwise they'd be working at Twitter down the road for possibly twice, sometimes 3 times the salary they were earning at Kanopy. So it was a very mission-based company. So it was easy to keep those values and arguably competitively advantageous to keep those values. Where it got difficult was as Kanopy grew and we needed more and more sophisticated people in the executive team. And with that, we had people coming from Google, from Twitter, from all sorts of these big tech companies where there was a lot of conversations about stock and equity and valuations at the table, which was something that took me a little bit of time to adjust to because we didn't ever consider those metrics in our growth strategy when at the executive meetings. We were always using other metrics to define success. But in order to attract the talent I needed, I had to pivot a little bit. And I found myself defending the values on more than many, many occasions, particularly when we're looking at decisions that definitely don't add to the bottom line, but add to the culture or add to the greater picture of what we were trying to achieve.
I want to talk about your decision then once, you know, you continue to grow, the market is very, very hot and you decide, I think I want to sell. I think it's time to start to exit the company, or at least in some form exit the company. After so long, how long had you been running the company by that point? Probably a decade.
Pretty much.
Yeah. What made you decide, you know what, I think it's time?
It was really about family because I really was having the time of my life. Working in film in America doesn't get much better. So another thing happened, which was the political environment was really difficult, particularly living in California, running an independent film platform under an administration which didn't value social anything really first, was difficult. And looking at my son, who had come to America when he was a baby and was now a 6-year-old, and one day he came home from school and dived under the table and showed me what he was taught that day. If a lone shooter came into the classroom, this is how we act. And I just thought, you know, being Australian, this is not how I wanted my son to grow up. He had the American accent and it was really cute. There were many amazing things America gave us, of course, but ultimately there was something missing, which was Australia. That's my husband and I were Australian, our whole family's Australian. We wanted to come home. And I, again, started feeling that trapped feeling. And I was looking ahead thinking I'm having the time of my life, but there's something more important to life than work, in my mind. Something way more important, which is living and our life there wasn't the one that my husband and I wanted for our family.
So Olivia Humphrey has taken Kanopy from her spare bedroom in Perth to San Francisco and turned down some pretty enticing investment offers that just didn't feel quite right. And good thing too, because she did manage to find the right investor and scored a bit of a mentor in shining armour in the process. But now it's time to head home. Olivia's an Aussie at heart and she's looking for a way out. But when you're the CEO of a giant company like Kanopy, well, that's easier said than done. In part 2, which is right there in your podcast feed right now, Olivia tries to sell Kanopy without selling out. So make sure you hit download on part 2 of this fascinating interview with Olivia, because she's about to face another curveball.